Welcome to the Sacred Healing Podcast, where the old is new, the ancient is innovative, and the forgotten is remembered. We believe that sacred healing is your birthright. Join us on each episode as we uniquely, authentically, and mystically dive into the bold and vulnerable life of many magical humans. From breath, spirituality, shadow work, and all things in the esoteric realm of healing, we don't leave any stone unturned on this bold journey of growth as we start to explore the remembrance of what it means to be human. So take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and let's get sacred. Hello, sacred humans. Welcome to the podcast. Today, I am chatting with my friend Sam. Sam is a student of life, he's a spiritual seeker, and he's a corporate mystic. While his job title involves leading revenue teams at software companies, his deeper pursuit lies in helping be a catalyst to inspire others on the inner journey of self-discovery and authentic expression, and also impactful service. After he returned from many journeys to Sub-Saharan and East Africa in his early 20s, he went through a deep period of questioning the methods of how you truly make a positive impact on those around you. He started questioning when you think the help that you're providing is actually hurting. And now, over a decade later, after multiple transformational plant medicine and psychedelic experiences, meditations, and initiations like fatherhood, Sam continues to refine the path of living as a spiritual being in this modern world. He's also a storyteller. He's committed to sharing his journey so others feel more empowered and more emboldened to do the same. He's on a journey from chronically chasing achievement to slowing down, accepting where he is, and learning the healing work of loving yourself. And Sam's also a friend. He's somebody that has shared some similar experiences. He and I both have experiences on the corporate side of the house, working in software companies. And so we really click on a deeper level with some of the experiences that we've had leading teams and also helping people and inspiring people to become the better versions of themselves so that we can all heal on a deeper level and all see the more beautiful world that all of our hearts know is possible. And so I'm really excited to welcome Sam Best to the show. Welcome everyone to the Sacred Healing Podcast. Today I have a really special guest, Sam. Sam and I met through a wonderful community, and we really got to know each other from my perspective. I'd love to hear your perspective, but from my perspective, I didn't really know you that well, and I was co-facilitating a breathwork ceremony in Montana back in May, and I had like a really just like reverent moment with you where I was watching you process grief, shame, like really like stepping into some full power. And I had such like an intimate moment with you, but your eyes were closed. You didn't know it was me. And like after that moment, I felt so much closer to you, just like spiritually, like as a soul. And since then, like cut to, we've gotten to know each other a little bit. And now here we are diving even deeper into kind of like getting to know one another. And I've been following your journey. You chronicle a lot of your spiritual journey online, which I love. And I'm excited to share more of that with the listeners. So thank you for being here, Sam. And I'll let you introduce yourself as well. But that's like my quick intro to just getting to know you.
Well, I love hearing that perspective as well, Jessica. I'm super excited to be here. It is a unique experience of what you mentioned there, and that breath work that you're helping facilitate, having such a deep connection with someone and be like, I don't know who that was, but someone was there holding space and witnessing me in the middle of my process. And it felt safe and wonderful. And then getting to find out like that was you and getting to drop in together. Has been really great. Super appreciative of that. Intro on myself. It's fun. I actually always like this question when people say, like, tell me about you and who you are. And I remember one time at work, I got asked that question, and my response was like, which version of me would you like to know about? I play a lot of roles in my life. In one part of my life, I'm a dad of two kids, a 7 and 3-year-old. Another part of my life, I'm married and have my 11th anniversary now in a few days. And another part of my life, right? That's a journey. We'll get into that too.
Congratulations.
And then, another part of my life, I swim in some corporate seas. And then I also have, there's so many facets and stories of what I feel like makes up the, kind of the pot pie of identity. Like, what are all the ingredients that go into it? So for now, I think I jokingly, but maybe more seriously, put on like a LinkedIn tagline. I think it says a spiritual being having a corporate journey, which is fun when you connect with some folks in the work world and have a little like nod, like, when a dog gets curious and it turns its head to the side and it's like, this is different. What is this? So I think that's something I think I aim to be in my life, not to intentionally be try to be unique or different, but I want to be as authentic as I can in my expression, that it doesn't so easily fit in any of the boxes or spaces that I might play in.
Yeah, and I think that there's an aspect of that I resonate deeply with too, because it's almost like being a chameleon to your environment, but in an authentic way, right? Like, you're able to move in spaces authentically, but also with different parts of yourself showing up to be in different genius zones or different genius areas of all these different parts of who you are. And those parts get to show up in different ways, depending on what environment you're in. So I really love that. And I guess what got you to this moment in time where you are being this chronicle of your spiritual journey? Like, what in your past led you to say, hey, I really need to go on this journey? And not only for self, but for family, because you mentioned you're a dad, you're a husband.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these different parts of you that might come into play with that. So what kind of got that started for you? What was the catalyst, or was there a catalyst for your journey?
Yeah, the first like moment that I remember having a connection to a vision that was bigger than myself, it was actually 13 years old. One of my best friends growing up, at the time, his cousins were the lead singer and drummer in this band that was really big, like late 90s, early 2000s, called POD. And we were backstage with them in Kansas City, and they were playing with this other band called Blindside. It was like my favorite band at the time. And the lead singer, Christian Lindskog, like, I still remember this conversation. We're backstage. I'm like my 13-year-old braces self, which I just had to get braces again 3 weeks ago as an adult, by the way. It's just, I'm reliving some of my childhood.
You know what? It's so funny because I was actually thinking of doing that because I had braces in high school and like totally just let everything go to waste, because now like my bottom teeth are crooked again. And I was like, dang it. I'm like, why'd I let this happen?
Wear your retainer, guys.
This is the whole purpose of this podcast. Wear a retainer.
Wear your retainer and a mouth guard. Don't grind your teeth at night,
Exactly.
So I was 13, braces, I had this orange Bob Marley shirt on. And I was chatting with the lead singer of this band that was playing with POD, and they had just gotten back from Ghana and were working with an organization that sponsored kids to get support for school, living resources, et cetera. And what was so significant about that for me was that was the first time I truly, as much as I could as a 13-year-old, really grasped that kids around the world live a very different life than I live. And there's something that I can do to positively impact it. And so at that moment, I was like, I want to go to Africa. I want to make a huge difference in the world. And I remember at like a student council camp the next year, we did this exercise. You write your goals on a board and you write all the obstacles on the other side. And you have this beautiful ceremony of like breaking through the board. And on there, I was like, I'm going to work at the UN. And so since I was like 13, 14 years old, that was like what I set my sights on. that was why I picked the university I went to. They had an African Studies department. They did study abroad in South Africa. And so I spent a lot of time went to school in South Africa. I was in Kenya and Uganda and Rwanda, and all my research was focused on the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. My wife and I were in the DRC in 2013 for a few months. And so when I think of the idea of living consciously or with awareness, I think from a fairly early age, I was questioning the sort of dominant narrative of culture, or the dominant narrative of what you're pursuing in life, and the questions to the answers to the questions of where do you find meaning, where do you find purpose. And so I would say that was more of this initiating event that oriented me on a track that was maybe different than most of the folks around me. And it's taken some dramatic turns since then, but I'd say that was where it all started.
Okay. So what did you learn in those travels that helped get you to the next track? Because you mentioned the word track, and we did a ceremony all around like being able to track things in your life and following threads. And so what was it for you during these travels? You met your wife. There's like a lot of things that are kind of coming to you during this time. What led you to to take that next step? Like, so you've gone through all these travels, then you come back and you're like, what do I do now? Like, what's the next step? How did you know? Was there like a greater knowing to kind of continue on that journey, or follow a thread there, or a track there?
Yeah, there's a few of them that really stood out to me. And the first and foremost, something I think I want to acknowledge that is important to me is the aspect of what I'll call like neo-colonialism. And what I mean by that, if that term might be unfamiliar for folks, it's, we think of the first wave of colonialism. You had empires coming into a region, claiming it like they own it, and then instilling their culture systems, monetary systems, et cetera, on top of a region and culture through force. And neocolonialism is more of doing it less overtly through force, but there is a way where you shift a culture to assimilate. And so that I share that just to give a bit of a foundation for commonality of language understanding. And that's something that I reconciled, of realizing where I had, in a way, unknowingly participated in neocolonialism, but because I was young, super idealistic, wanted to change the world, and had these dreams and ideas, and what I didn't realize I was doing was going into a space that I did not, the history of that space was not my lived history. The experience of that people was not my experience. And coming in and saying, like, I know how to influence, I know how to positively impact change. And I've forgiven myself for that, but it's also something I like have to look in the mirror and realize, like, oh, I participated in trying to put a different cultural narrative, even if it might have been through the lens of how we as Americans view progress, how we view success, what we view as the ultimate aim in your life, of what truly gives freedom, stability, satisfaction, fulfillment. Those might be very different culture to culture. And so I think a big thing I learned in one of the tracks I followed was that I think does apply so much to even like the way I lead teams today, is the difference between thinking you have the right narrative and placing that on top of someone else, versus drawing out understanding of someone else's narrative, what's important to someone else, what's meaningful to someone else, what dreams, visions, projects do they have in mind? How can you use your resources to help support where they're going and what they want to achieve, what they want to accomplish with their view and understanding? And that's very different then I think how I had approached life and how I had approached how do you make an impact on others? How do you help free others? So that was something that was really significant for me in reconciling with and processing like my experience overseas. The big shift though happened, it was actually when my wife and I got to the airport in Kigali in Rwanda to fly home from the Congo. And I broke down bawling and looked at my wife and I said, I don't ever want to come back. And it was, I now have language for what that moment was because of Eric Godsey at the first summit, talking about the thrice born consciousness. And that first moment you enter what he referred to as the wasteland, where that vision of who you are, how you interact with the world, why you're here, when that dies, how destabilizing that can feel. I didn't know that's what was happening at the time, but now I have language to make sense of that experience. Because what happened in that moment for me, and this was a decade ago, almost exactly, who I thought I was, how I oriented myself to what I'm trying to do in the world, and where I found purpose, where I found meaning for at that time, for the previous 10 years of my life, had all been building up to this moment of being in this conflict zone and seeing how I can make a difference. And then it also died where I knew that I just had such a deep knowing moving forward, I'm going a different way. And so who am I now? What am I? What's meaningful? What's purpose? Do I get a job? Do I like, it was just all of a sudden, like I didn't know where I was going because the story that oriented me of like, I'm going to go to Baylor, I'm going to minor in African studies, I'm going to study abroad, like everything was oriented toward that goal of like doing development work overseas. And then when that ended, all of a sudden my map was gone. And so I would say that was probably one of the most significant reflections on that experience.
Ooh. Well, astrologically, we're going through this like big shift right now from being kind of in that like Pisces era to now in the era of ideas and the era of listening. And so when you talk about going into different countries with really good intentions, right? Like great intentions behind it. But at the end of the day, you're realizing, oh, I was going in there with not full information about what that experience might have been for the people that lived there. And so we're in this age now where there's really a shift to deep listening and deep kind of ideologies coming about, and understanding that even in that like 10-year ago moment in your life, you're saying now it's coming up around 10 years. It's like, what a synchronicity to feel back into that moment and say, man, okay, this is what was happening here. And now I've followed these tracks to get where I am right now today, based off of not only deep listening to self, but deep listening to others and to culture. And so I think it's a beautiful journey to be able to kind of reflect on that and also look back and say, oh, okay, now that makes sense. That's why I went through that. Because you never really know why something happens in your life. You're not really able to like put together all the synchronicities until like it's finally like, oh, this now happened and here's why. So I think it's kind of cool to be able to look back on those tracks and know that you were following that and that happened for a very specific reason so that you could get where you are today. You've also talked about kind of using this, and you're kind of following this thread into your life, but now, you know, talking about going into spiritual circles. And I think something that's really prevalent in spiritual communities is almost like, and you and I have chatted about this before we jumped on here, is just like chasing the next high. And so how do you integrate all of your learnings into your life? And maybe we can chat about really specific learnings. You mentioned the learning specifically from Eric Godsey, who's a mutual friend of ours, and is a Jungian and very intellectual and heady man. And I think, when we look at going into ceremony and we look at going into community, there's adrenaline, there's this high, there's all of these things that are happening. There's so much community, so much support. But then cut to, you go back into everyday life, and that's almost where the ceremony begins. So that's when you have to actually integrate all of those lessons and learnings into life. And so it seemed like you had one of those moments even 10 years ago when you came back from the Congo and you were like, holy shit, now I have to go and like be in life and do something with all of the information that I've just gathered. And like, holy shit, that's a lot to carry. So how do you navigate kind of weaving in and out of ceremony and also in and out of everyday life?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a major caveat I'll put here is, like all of us, I'm massively still learning this. And I will continue to do so, I think, until my body's in the ground. Who knows where my soul's going to be. So I think when I look at my previous mountaintop experiences, my first experience, that I grew up like really heavily in the church. And so it was like going to church camp in the summer, you'd have this like big spiritual high and then it'd come crashing down. And then now, like, I look at where I've gone in my own spiritual journey now, of like when I first, I use the language of my life was saved with psychedelics. Like it was the first time in my life I felt so deeply home in my experience and in my being and my body. I got to feel who I was in a completely new way. And then after that really normal experience of then being like, I want to feel that again. That was so transformative. And then there was a period of my life where I was like, this is the answer. This is what everyone needs. And it's funny when you look back at, when I think about the idea of orienting to a map or orienting to, like I said, like, how do you integrate? You can look at other people who've gone down a similar path, and did they face and go through the same things that you went through? And, it's, if you read a lot of some of the earlier writings or teachings, like of like Ram Dass and Tim Leary in that early era of their psychedelic research, there was a similar sentiment of almost like evangelicalism. Like, we need to evangelize this. Like, this is the answer. If everyone just had experiences with these types of medicines, it would change everything. And I think I get that, because I feel like there was a similar phase I then went through. And what's helped me like have these, whether it's going on retreat, or if you do a 10-day Vipassana and you do a silent meditation retreat, or you do a bunch of breathwork experiences, or you go down to the jungle and sit with medicine, it's all, I look at what's your core orientation to life. We hear a lot of that quote of like, do you view life as it happening to you or for you? And what's the biggest thing that's helped me integrate these experiences is less of a rigid practice of like, this is what I do every time. I do have steady practices. Like, I have a regular meditation practice. I've been journaling as long as I can remember. That's how I can sort of make sense of pulling these ethereal spiritual experiences into a reality I can understand through written language is really helpful for me. But the biggest thing that helps me comes from Ram Dass talking about everything in your life is grist for the mill for your own awakening. My paraphrase of that is essentially, everything in life is the exact curriculum you need for your own awakening. If awakening is a triggering word, think of the way that you get more free as your whole authentic self. And so one of the big ways I feel like I integrate these experiences is kind of taking everything in motion. Like, I almost think of, I've never done jujitsu, but I can imagine, it's like, I see enough people do it, like taking someone's energy and then using it and shifting it for something else. And I think of doing that with every experience in my life. So it doesn't matter if it's like, wow, that was the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. Great. What is this teaching me for my own freedom and my own awakening? Or like, wow, this feels like the hardest thing I've ever gone through my entire life. I'm dark night of the soul. And I have a deep trust that this is still for me and it's still for my awakening. Like you get the job you always wanted. Great. How is this for my awakening? You just lost the job. How is this for my awakening? And so that I feel like that one orientation is probably my deepest like integration practice that I have.
Hello, sacred humans. Quickly, I want to share with you something I've added into my daily rituals that has me buzzing, and that is Rise Mushroom Coffee. Rise entered my life through my Instagram algorithm that obviously knows what products I like, and I gave it a try, and just wow, it has amazingly delicious flavor. Not only this, they also have a mushroom matcha powder. Phew, mind blown. And they're filled with superfoods and super mushrooms. What I like about Rise is that they use 100% organic ingredients, and their mushroom farms are located in California. If you've always wanted to try mushroom coffee but haven't yet pulled the trigger, this is your moment. And there is zero risk because they have a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you're interested in the deliciousness of Rise mushroom elixirs, head to the show notes and you will find a link for 20% off your first order. Or simply use the discount code Jessica, all caps, at checkout. That's JESSICA, all caps, at checkout. And now, let's get back to our amazing episode of the Sacred Healing Podcast. So, kind of diving deep into a few things you said. The first thing I want to touch on is journaling, because you mentioned how important it is to kind of take these lessons and learnings and actually like write them down to make more sense of them for you specifically. And I think that's one of the sacred healing practices that is one of the like easiest. Don't need a teacher, don't need to go anywhere. You can pick up a pen immediately right now in this moment and like start that now. So for people listening that are like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, like where do I start? A pen and paper and just kind of free flow your thoughts. So I kind of want to double click on your journaling practice, just for folks out there that might not know what to do with information that they're getting from universe, lessons, daily life, even just like, you know, walking out of your house and being like, like that person in front of me is driving too slow. Like, what does this all mean? Right. So like, even just like the mundane moments, what does your journaling practice look like? And how do you do you free flow? Do you have like, a specific methodology that you follow there?
Yeah. The one thing I'll say for if folks are looking to get started with journaling and the idea feels overwhelming, like I don't even know what to write, I found the easiest is just setting a time container for yourself. Set a timer on your phone for 10 minutes. And your only goal is I'm just not going to stop writing for 10 minutes. And all I'm going to write is whatever is in my mind. And that I found can be really helpful because like there's a time bound, so it's not going to be a forever. There's no expectation of what comes out. So that if journaling has felt intimidating or unapproachable, that's one of the easiest ways I found. Just set it 10 minutes and just write whatever comes in your mind. For me, because I do know I've tried some of the more structured journal practices, but for me, it really is just I'm writing like what's on my mind that day. The one that was one of the most impactful was it was a year ago. I did like a 30-day gratitude journaling practice, and just 30 days writing out everything I could think of that I was grateful for. And the most challenging part of that for me was I had to mean it. Because there's one be like, oh, I'm grateful for these things. If I write all these spiritual things, then I'm going to be spiritual. But like, I'm not feeling any of this. And there is a chicken and the egg scenario. You're like, am I going to feel it after I step into the practice, or I have to feel it with the practice? But I really worked on like getting to a place of resonance where I mean what I'm writing. And so that's one of the few like structured things I did. I would say it was deeply impactful. 30 days. Writing out a minimum of 3 things I'm genuinely grateful for. And that started to orient me to my world a bit differently. But outside of that, it really is just, I think what I oscillate between is here's what's on my mind. I want to process. Like I'm going through something. I don't know how to talk to anyone about it. So I'm going to write about it. Often my journals end up like written prayers as well. I'd say that those are the two that are most often used, writing out what I'm what I'm praying for, what I'm working through, is it peace, is it hardship I'm going through, is it heartbreak, is it longing, what are the like hopes and desires that I'm sitting in right now, what's the pain I'm sitting in right now, confusion I'm sitting in, maybe clarity I might be sitting in. And I found that as you write, or at least for me, also speaking, as I write, things will kind of illuminate, like, oh, that is really what I'm feeling, or that is really what I'm thinking, or that feels less murky than it did before, or maybe that feels way more murky than I thought it did, but I'm also okay with it, So I feel like that's what comes up for me journaling.
Yeah, and journaling is a form of expression, and so it's a form of clearing. And sometimes in breath work we talk about somatically clearing, right? And when you clear out, you become more clear. And I think that journaling is similar to that, in that it's a form of expression. It's a form of art, even it can be, to really just like kind of clear out what's going on in your system and writing it all on paper. But like you said, authentically, right? Like what it really is, like tuning into, almost like a little tuning fork, like what actually is here for me, not just like I want to write I'm grateful for whatever because somebody else said that you had to be grateful for these things in order to feel a certain way to reach nirvana, whatever it is, right? So it's almost like a little bit of a tuning fork too. So I appreciate that you have that practice, and thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important, and it's such a really, just like, I don't want to say easy, because I don't think it's easy, but I think it's a tool that everyone has access to. And by everyone, I mean, you can pick up a stick and write in a piece of dirt. It doesn't have to be a pen to paper. And it's one of those things that you have access to in every single moment. And so I appreciate that practice. One of the other things I wanted to double click on that you were talking about is all of these kind of ceremonial experiences that you've had. You mentioned plant medicine being almost like a lifesaver for you. I'm curious if you're willing to recall, it doesn't have to be your first experience, but experiences that you've had with ceremonies, and what was that lifesaver for you? What kind of shifted that? Because that's a huge thing to say. But also just for people that are listening that are like, ding, what does he mean by that? I'm curious to know what your experience is there. And then I think kind of weaving this all into what we originally started talking about is like integration, right? So what was that experience? And would love as much detail as you're willing to share. And then how did you take those lessons and then integrate those in a deeper way?
Yeah. And like happy to be open about those experiences as well, because as someone who grew up in an environment, and like church environment and even university, where there's a lot that feels taboo, I think it's really important for spaces like this. Why I'm so grateful for like the podcast you're creating, and where there's more spaces for people to share about their experiences openly, and then it frees other people to say like, oh, maybe I'm okay too, or I'm not alone in that as well. And I think especially if you have the privilege of having a microphone, then you should use it to share that, so it gives safety for other people. So for me, my introduction into the plant medicine world was, I think maybe a lot of us have this experience, was actually through festivals. It was like 8 years ago out in California. Some friends invited me, my wife and I, this thing called Lightning in a Bottle. I had no idea what that was. I'd never been to a music festival like that. And a dear friend of mine had offered me the experience of taking LSD together. And I was terrified, because I was like, I don't want to lose control. I've just heard all the stories. And I was also deconstructing my faith at the time. So I was like, how does this fit into my orientation to like what is good, what's right, what's righteous? Like, just, it was a lot. There was a soup of confusion for me. And it was my wife at the time, pregnant with our first kid, was like, I think you should do this. And because I was reconciling for me, what are all the things that my dad unconsciously passed down to me that if I don't look at and face, I will now unconsciously pass down to my child. And I want to do something about that. And that was my motivation to get into healing work. Was I'm about to be a father, and anyone who is thinking about becoming a parent or is on their way to becoming a parent, there's nothing you can do to prepare for it. And our species, thankfully, has done this for quite a long time. So you'll figure it out too. But for me, it was I wanted to face the things that I didn't know, so that I didn't. Of course, you can't not pass down any of your wounds. We all have wounds we're working through, and triggers and patterns, but I wanted to look at them all. So that was my motivation initially, was actually just becoming a father. Was that, and that, as a man, there's different initiations you go through, and for men and women, becoming a parent is a massive initiation. So the big thing when I say it saved me, and I don't mean that hyperbolically, I do mean quite literally, is that I, for the first time in my life, got so present to the way that I describe it like white knuckling life. I was so scared, but I didn't know how to be honest about that. And I was just so afraid. I was like, God, if I can just make it work out, it's going to be okay. It's that just a gripping life and so much control, which was rooted in so much fear, so much anxiety, that I'm not foundationally, cosmically, infinitely held and safe. I felt the opposite. I felt infinitely and cosmically unsafe. And the thing that I thought gave me safety was if I can control it all, if I can make it work out the way I think it's supposed to go, it'd be okay. And that will give you a heart attack. and I, for the first time in my life, in that medicine experience, felt a different energy come in, of like almost a feminine flow of like moving with life as it comes. And I felt my body, and somatically started dancing and moving in a way that I never felt my body move in my entire life at that point. And I was like, my hands can move like this, my body can move like this. Like, whoa, this feels so different. And it was an external physical representation of what was happening spiritually and energetically. There was a loosening of the grip that fear and anxiety had in my life. And it taught me that even if only for that moment, in that container, that space I was under, that experience, I could at least know that it's possible for me to move through life differently than I'd been doing it, than maybe my dad had been doing it, than maybe his dad had been doing it. And that maybe I could consciously, with tools, help support community, ceremony, maybe I could do it differently than they all did it. And that was the door, I would say, that was opened for me in my first ever psychedelic experience.
Okay, so getting into these experiences in music festival world is actually how a lot of people find these types of experiences. How did you find your experience outside of one of those containers, in a more very intentional, I'm going into this to have this experience, not oh, okay, I'll do this. You had an intention, but it was an offered rather than a seeking. And so did that one experience lead you to seek out other intentional experiences, or what was the journey to the next? Because you start with LSD, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Cut to you're like, hey, let me just go right in. What was the next ceremony that you experienced, and how did you kind of follow that thread of feeling so alive and so open and so clear from control to oh, okay, I want to experience that again, but now I want to have I want to choose my experience with it.
Yeah. It's funny that as you ask this, I'm realizing that it was an intuitive hit. There was a woman that my wife met when she first did her permaculture design course when we lived in San Diego, like 3 years prior at the time. And there's this woman who did the whole course on zone zero. If you're unfamiliar with permaculture, the idea of zone zero is, is yourself. Like, what is your inner environment? How are you creating a regenerative space, a loving space within yourself? And my wife had this like deep experience with this woman who taught that portion of her permaculture design course, and we had stayed in touch with her and her husband since then. And after that experience I had at Lightning a Bottle, I just felt this strong need that I needed to email her and tell her everything that just happened to me. Because we had done some other work with her. I had no idea about like plant medicine world, like any of that. I knew that they had mentioned like they spent like 7 years in the jungle in the Amazon. I didn't even know how to pronounce ayahuasca. But I was like, maybe I think I just had this intuitive hit that she probably knows about these things and knows what just happened to me, because no one else in my circle, I feel like, could help me make sense of this. So I sent her a long email explaining like kind of like, this is everything I just went through. And she reached back out to me and let me know that they hold ceremony. And if that's something that I would like to do before my wife and I are about to move out of California to come back to Texas to raise a kid closer to family. So I had a window of time, and my wife and I both, at the time, like barely any money, like just making it. My wife's pregnant, and we both felt like this is the time to really dive into this healing work. So I sought out to work with her and sat my first mushroom ceremony that was guided like by a medicine woman. And I remember my intention for that so clearly. I actually drew an image of a figure sitting in like a meditative lotus posture. In their head was the yin and yang symbol, and then in each hand they were holding the light and then the dark. And my intention was, I want to see both my light and my dark and fully accept myself. So I was deconstructing a lot of shame. A lot of the religious narratives was still so fresh for me, and so the idea of accepting all of myself was radical at that time. And that ceremony for me was where I went through and really began the healing journey of like the deepest shame experience, like what I would say was my most traumatic experience that ever happened in my life, where I felt really shamed and exiled. I saw my father in like a completely new light. And I'd already been really working on restoring and building a relationship with my dad since I was about 20. But that experience so fully shifted my relationship with my dad. So that I would say that was my first healing experience, that I was able to then start seeing like the power of an intentional ceremony and what it can open up for you, what it can shift in your family relationships, personal relationships. Like I think that was kind of where I don't know if I would say I never looked back, but in a way I was like, this is the path I'm on now.
Mm. Well, thank you for sharing that. And also, I think this aspect of shadow and light is coming into our consciousness now as a collective even. And it's like there's been like little kind of clues hidden in not only in religion, but also in even like cinematography. Like you look at like Batman, like you have to have the dark to have the light. You have to. And so the concept of the yin yang is really kind of, I feel like, coming into awareness for a lot of people that are opening up to their sacred power of being able to hold both. Like we can hold both. And also with that, like you said, comes the process of shame, comes the process of feeling all of the weight of that. Can you talk a little bit more about that shame process and how you went through that? Because I think a lot of people, especially folks that are like deeply into religion or coming out of religion, or like questioning beliefs that they were told their whole life. And I think a lot of people are waking up to kind of questioning. And so I do think a lot of people will resonate with what you're saying. How did you process that shame? Like how did you process that? And what was like the real root of that? If you don't mind explaining more there.
Yeah. So my initial introduction into shame, like many of us, is when I give a major acknowledgement to Brene Brown. That first TEDx talk she ever did. I
love Brene Brown.
Oh my God.
What an amazing, like, beautiful human. It's so funny because, and I don't want to interrupt your flow, but my first podcast is called Bold and Vulnerable. And like the amount of like influence that Brene had on me, just like being a vulnerable human being and like really truly stepping into like my full authenticity was just like one of, I will say, life-changing moments. She's just such an intellect, but she speaks to people in a way where you can really understand what she's saying and not feel stupid.
Yes. It's so
she explains
true.
it well. Yeah.
That like being a PhD and like deep in research and is so accessible.
Today, I want to share with you all the delicious cacao with a K drinking chocolate. Cacao is one of my favorite brands of ceremonial grade cacao and is a delicious addition to my morning routine. Cacao is jam-packed with delicious nutrients that work with my body to stay energized, connected, and focused. What I also love about cacao is that they are a nonprofit on a mission to protect the native heirloom strands of cacao in both Peru and Guatemala by giving back to the farmers and communities that make it available to us. If you are interested in cacao with a K, go to the show notes and you will find a link for 10% off your first order, or simply by using the discount code Jessica, all caps, at checkout. That's JESSICA, all capital letters, at checkout. Yeah, absolutely. So tell me more about how you learned about shame from Brene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So prior to any of my first medicine experiences, it was actually the man that we stayed with in Kigali before we flew out from the Congo. He came and saved us in San Diego, and he was like, "Hey, I got to show you this TEDx talk." And that was her first TEDx talk on shame that had just recently come out and just went viral. And he shared it with me, and I'm sitting there on my couch bawling, and it hit something so deep in me. And so then I bought her, at the time, I think it was one of her first books called Gifts of Imperfection. And I remember sitting out looking over Bird Rock. If you've ever been to San Diego, it's this rock that's covered in birds.
I have been to San Diego. I used to live there, actually.
Really?
Yeah. Where did you guys live in San Diego?
We were in Hillcrest. We were like right across the street from the north side of Balboa Park.
Okay. I was in University Heights, which is like right on the border of Hillcrest.
Super close.
So super close. Funny. We'll have to talk about this later.
Yeah. We'll connect on that. But I was sitting in Bird Rock in La Jolla reading The Gifts of Imperfection and just like looking at shame, looking at my perfectionism, which really is just fear. I was so afraid to get it wrong because I didn't, for me, shame, I'll describe it and I'll separate shame and vulnerability. I have some visuals that help me understand how I relate to those. So my shame for me, I don't want to universalize my experience. For me personally, what my shame felt like is that I was in life, I'm walking on a balance beam and there's an infinite abyss on either side. And if I get it wrong, so it leads to so much constriction, fear, tightening, because I'm so afraid to get it wrong. Because there's been times in my life where I feel like I did slip and then I feel like because of some of the church culture I was in, I felt like destroyed. And so I was so afraid of that. And then, so that what that led to was a lot of not wanting to share and open up in vulnerability because it was shame itself feels like a shadow. But that's one of the deep shadows and pitfalls of shame is for me, it influenced me to kind of open up less and less and less. And I shared, I thought it was really, I'm like, oh, I'm super open. People know who I am. But really I had I'm like, oh yeah, no one gets to go there though. Because I did open up to one person before and they hurt me so bad. Not doing
And
that again.
Brene says that shame only exists when there's secrecy, silence, and judgment. And so like the fact that you were saying, I was like closing in, secrecy, silence, and then you tried to share judgment, right? Yep. So like it just like you shame your shame at that point. You're like
spiral.
Just like shame on top of my shame on top of my shame. And then it's a Russian doll of shame.
Yeah. I'm shaming myself about being in shame. And you're like, oh gosh. Yeah. And so what and I'll kind of touch on it. I feel like I talk about shame in the concept of exile for hours because I've sat with it a lot. And so when I look at, I'll zoom out really quick and be like, this is my perspective on shame as it relates to our own biology. And then I'll share like what was really the initial opening for me to start healing that. This is why I think Brene Brown struck such a cultural chord in like the zeitgeist, like why she blew up talking about shame and vulnerability is we developed as a species. Your survival was directly related to staying in the tribe. And so anything that you did, if you did something shameful and you got exiled, death. And so we have such a deep, like biological evolutionary history of fear of exile. And right now, a bit of a different rabbit hole. I'm not going to go down it, but what we're seeing from like cancel culture to the way we're exiling people versus inviting people into conversation. You have a different opinion than I do. You've did life differently. I'm curious about that versus exiling. Every group is kind of just doing this exiling of each other thing. And this is why I think what Brene Brown's talking about with shame is so culturally important, because I think it's so healing when we can all realize like you can see yourself in the eyes of another. And I'm like, even though the way you express your pain is different than the way I did, I know the pain. And so I can connect with you. And I feel like shame, what you said there is like, yeah, the secrecy, the hiddenness, the close in, which then turns into isolation, turns into I'm alone, and you pull further and further back from the community. And what started to heal that for me was actually that first ceremony with that medicine woman. She was really connected with animal kingdom and seeing where those were coming in. And she was like, I asked her like, hey, did anything come up for you in the ceremony? She's like, around like animal medicine. And she mentioned, I don't know if you realize that when you were laying on the ground, I was drawing these eagle wings around you. It's like, what does that mean? She was like, well, you're a seer. It's like, what does that mean? She's like, are you ever in conversation with people where you have insight into something that you should have no reason to know or no knowledge of, and you're able to communicate and hit something like so deep within someone? I was like, all the time. She's like, it's because you're a seer. It's like, oh, she's like, that's your spiritual gift. I'm like, that makes sense. I've had that my whole life. And then what she said was, your ability to operate in your gift as a seer is directly correlated to your willingness to be seen. I was like, oh, no, that's vulnerable.
Damn it.
I was like, no, I did that and I got burned. I'm not doing that again. Mm-hmm. And so that's something for me. It was, instead of the eagle, was actually the hawk I really connected with. And it's been something that's been with me every time I've opened up in vulnerability. The red-tailed hawk will fly through. And I don't mean that metaphorically, like literally, like the red-tailed hawk, the hawk will show up for me every time I step out in deep vulnerability. And so I think how that's been when you talk about integrative practices, anytime I have that feeling of like, oh, I don't want to share that, that's my like, ding, ding, ding. This is your opportunity to step into vulnerability. And I have discernment. I know there's spaces that are obviously, it's not appropriate, it's not safe. And I do think that one of the ways we heal shame, both individually and I think in the collective, is sharing those stories and is sharing that pain. And there's the last thing I'll share on this monologue. I went to one of my favorite DJs was playing in town like a week and a half ago. Huge shout out to Sammy, known as Ellis Dream. He at one point stopped his set and he was like, guys, I just want to like level with you. Um, I was feeling really sad today. Like I just played the show in Austin. He was playing in my town, San Marcos. He was like, I've just been feeling really sad. And I want to be open about that because he was like, I do this for a living. I get to play music and dance and create art and I get paid. And I still get sad sometimes for no reason that I can put my finger on. So if you're feeling that way, this is why it's so important to love yourself. It's so important to love each other. It's so important to have that community because this is why mental health is so important to talk about. And what I felt like he did in that moment was he was breaking through that isolation barrier by saying, look, I have this life that you all, it'd be easy to idolize. It'd be easy to be like, he's got it all. He's like, and I still get sad. And I think that's where we can start to heal. And that's why I've found healing as an individual, sharing the things I'm like, I can't share that. I'm going to be exiled. And then I share that and then I'm safe. Like the breathwork experience, you witnessing me literally working through my shame and being not only like you're safe, as in there's an absence of threat, but there's a presence of love. And I think as we do that individually and collectively, we get to start to work through, we get to work through it. That's where I feel like I've worked through a lot of that shame. And I see the power in how many times I've stepped out and what I thought was really scary and really vulnerable. And then you just hear yeah, me too. I know what that's like. And I think that's one of the practices of how I've worked through my shame.
Yeah. And Brene also says empathy is a hostile environment for shame. And you mentioned like when you can start to empathize with other people's circumstances, you can start to like unveil some of that shame being separate from guilt. We could go on about the two, but also, one thing that I wanted to note that you mentioned is that there's discernment there too. There's specific people that don't need to hear about your shame too. Mm-hmm. And in the container that you mentioned with your, with the DJ, it's like he was aware that everyone in that container came to see him. We're there to hold space pretty much for him to share his artwork. And so he could share that piece of him to say, hey, like, this is my feeling in this moment. And it just gave everyone full fucking permission to not only have empathy for what he was going through, but also like connect to self even deeper and to say, damn, like that he said that gives me like full permission that I can share in my circles too. And so when I say empathy is kind of like a volatile environment for shame, whenever we start to put ourselves in each other's shoes, that's when shame can start to dissipate for us. And that breathwork experience that I was like honored to witness you going through, was there a download or anything that came to you during that ceremony when you were kind of working through some stuff? Because breathwork in itself can be its own like semi-plant medicine journey. And I'm curious if anything was going on for you at that moment that you were working through.
Yeah. And that experience in that breathwork ceremony was my first ever like intentional sort of like shamanic breathwork session I had gone through. So I had heard about it. People were like, oh, breathwork. Like I know how to breathe, but I had no idea like what I was getting into. And one of the big things that came through for me around shame was because of my own, both brotherhood wound and like father wound, I have spent so much of my life chasing the affirmation and acknowledgement, particularly of a male authority figure. Not a specific one. Like it could be like my dad, but I've talked to my dad enough about this now because I've done this work where I'm like, let's go straight into these conversations. Like, are you proud of me? Can we talk about that? So I've done that work with my biological father, but there's this deeper like archetypal, male authority that I've spent my whole life chasing affirmation and acknowledgement from, when are they, who's the man that's finally going to tell me I'm good enough, or that I'm worthy of love, that I'm not a fuck up, or what, all of this stuff in my head and heart. And for me in that breathwork session, it was seeing the possibility of me being the one to give that space to myself. And that, and this is going to kind of zoom out a little bit on just fit for service in the whole container versus just that breathwork session. That experience was yet another notch, in all my experiences in fit for service, where one of the biggest things that shifted for me is, for the first time in my life, I can say with authenticity and conviction that I'm truly proud of myself. And I've never been able to say that and truly mean it, like, in my life. And that breathwork experience was just yet another one of those powerful experiences in the fit for service container, where I got to practice holding that space for myself. And I got to see the power of giving that acknowledgement to myself. And I got to see, like, wait a minute, Sam, you're sitting here on a mat, breathing, crying, shaking in Montana because you care about growth. You care about being a better man. You care about making an impact on others. Like, look at yourself. This is amazing. And I got to, like, acknowledge that, because I think I was so afraid of pride. I grew up in the church, and the idea of pride was really, pride comes before the fall, and there's this whole false humility message that was so ingrained. I think it was C.S. Lewis, how really humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. I may falsely attribute that to C.S. Lewis, and it might be someone else, but you get the idea. And so I didn't realize how inextricably linked those ideas were with me not knowing how to heal my shame, because I had to there's so much that had to be sort of reconciled for me to give myself permission to be proud of myself. And so that was, I would say, that breathwork ceremony was one of the first times I got to witness me being the one to acknowledge me in the way I've always wanted to be acknowledged.
And then we start to learn that it's like everything's inside, right? Mm-hmm. Like the external validation is no longer needed when you realize that your full power to be proud of you, or to feel or not feel shame, or to be in any state is internal, not external. And when you get a little taste of that bit of your own powerfulness, you're like, damn, that feels really good. Mm-hmm. And kind of coming around full circle to the damn, that feels really good moments in life. Then when you go out of those ceremonies, sometimes there's like a big dip, because you're like, oh man, like I was so held in that ceremony, in that community, in that, whatever that thing is. And then now I have to go into everyday life where mm-hmm. maybe there's other circumstances that are really kind of like testing some of that. Can you talk about how you integrate some of these really, really big, powerful lessons into life? Because especially being a father, being a husband, being somebody who leads teams, sometimes not everything's going to go exactly your way. And like we talked about the aspect of, loosening control a little bit. And sometimes people can kind of like chase these highs rather than really like fully integrating all these lessons into life. So how do you take all of these learnings and really like integrate them into being a dad, being a husband, being a leader, in corporate world, and also as you walk in life? So how do you really like integrate all of that rather than like chasing the next thing?
Yeah, it's, for me, it's kind of a bit of almost like a multi-tiered process. And circles us back to journaling. It's always important for me after these spiritual experiences, these mountaintop experiences, to then journal what's everything I just went through, what's everything I can like recall and remember. And I also have the understanding that language is simply symbolic representation. So it's never going to quite capture the thing we want. It's like, you know, the difference between I'm trying to explain to you what the Mona Lisa looks like, and I on this whiteboard draw you a stick figure. And I'm like, it was kind of like that. And you're like, oh, okay. But
We should
it's
do that
still,
right now. Do you want to?
yeah, right. I could, yeah, I'll give my best shot at Da Vinci.
Yeah.
And no promises. But I think so for me, like the first step for me is always journaling. That helps me. I really appreciated actually the simple framework that Aubrey taught us in Fit for Service of like, you know, the pearl, the diamond, and the ruby. I think that's how it was. But even just capturing like what was the pearl, what was like the pearl that you're going to take away from this experience, the wisdom you're going to take away, like even if it was just 1, 2, 3 things. Whether you're coming out of a plant medicine ceremony, you're a festival, you're a breath work, you're an ecstatic dance, a birth. I mean, anything in life, can you be like, what was the one pearl from that? And so that helps me sort of codify the experience a little bit. And then you know, it's almost like, I think like baking bread. I'm like, okay, then how can I then take it and then be like, so now that I've done at least a bit of the codifying, I've written down, I've not totally isolated it into something I can verbally define. That's one thing I'm learning very recently, about more of a somatic feeling, like learning I can just feel things without having to intellectually be able to articulate. That's a new process for me. I'm just getting into the last like month or two. But once I write it down, then I can start to look at, okay, how does this apply in my life? And I feel like, because I have chased, I don't want to act like I'm some holy person that didn't fall into that. Absolutely. Like after I had these experiences, fundamentally changed my life. And so then it was like, okay, let's keep doing this. Like, let's do more of these. What changes my life is like the ceremonies, and it's the medicine. It's the ecstatic peak experiences, you know, and I did like chase that for a while. And now it's still like an integrative, like regular part of my practice, or like my healing work is sitting in the ceremony. But I think the biggest shift of how I integrate is more of in a moment where your nervous system is triggered. Doesn't matter what it is. Are you at work and you got a Slack message from your boss about something that triggers you? Your toddler yells at you that you made the waffles wrong. You know, your wife and her spouse or partner, you have some disagreement over something arbitrary that becomes the same fight you've had for a decade. You know, what, like, doesn't matter what it is. You get triggered into a nervous system response where whether it's a fight, flight, freeze, fawn, you go into some dysregulation, a dysregulated state. In that moment, when I look at, for me, this is where all the medicine work, all the retreats, all the practices, for me, it all boils down to like one really simple thing is, how do you regulate your nervous system? And what I mean by that, for some people, they know exactly, like, oh, I know exactly what we're talking about. Other people, it's like, what the hell do you mean regulate your nervous system? When you're frazzled, can you in a moment pause before you respond? Because typically, I think when I look at my life, it's like there'd be a trigger and response. You know, it's like Newton's law, like equal opposite reaction. Can I catch when the trigger hits me? There's like a blip of a moment. Can I catch it to pause? So to get even more practical, my breath. That's it. Like that's how I work through this. I love that you're a breathwork practitioner. Like it's just, when I feel totally overwhelmed, can I name it? I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. And then I can take a few conscious breaths, and I just have a little bit more space to not respond in a triggered way. And I think that's the thing that there's the animalistic, instinctual, reactive part of me. There's all different spiritual traditions. I feel like, reptilian brain, monkey brain, Christianity called it the flesh. Like we all have different ways we try to talk about that response, the unconscious response. And so for me, like how I integrate all of these things is just, it all comes down to like, in a moment where the trigger happens, can I pause long enough to calm my nervous system so that I can consciously decide what I want to do differently in that moment than the biological pattern would have me do otherwise.
For those of you who don't already know, my husband and I own a coffee company called Gay Head Coffee. And of course, we drink our own coffee every day, and it's some of the most flavorful and inviting coffee, especially with the nostalgia of coming from a can rather than paper or plastic packaging. But I'm biased, so check it out for yourself. If you're interested, head over to the show notes where you will find a link to order your coffee today from gayheadcoffee.com. That's GAYHEADCOFFEE.com. Thank you all for your support. It means the world to us as a small business. I absolutely love that. Especially since it involves breath and like that, breath is the number one way to regulate a dysregulated nervous system. And so it is, we all have this power. It's our breath. It's the first thing we do when we come into this life, and it's the last thing we do before we leave. And we can use that power and harness it in a way that just makes us pause just a moment. And so if there's anything taken from integration, that's so huge. But I will say that you should probably make the waffles right. Because that's unacceptable.
I think so.
Yeah.
So much shame.
Oh my gosh. Kids will just, they'll just rip you to shreds. It's like, fuck. Yeah. Less syrup, more syrup. I didn't know. Yeah. I didn't know.
You do your best.
Yeah. But you should have known. Really. You should have known.
I know. I can't mind read yet.
Yeah. I want to talk about two things. One is the journaling practice that you mentioned, the pearl, the ruby, and the diamond. I have my notebook somewhere around here, and I will get it if we need it. Do you remember what the inner workings of that journaling practice were? Because I forgot about it until you just mentioned it in this moment. And I was like, damn, that's like something that I really want to revisit. Do you remember what those three things were?
I do. So the pearl is kind of like, what's that one nugget of wisdom that you want to take? That was the most impactful. Wow, I've never heard that before. That shifts things for me. So I imagine it codifying into a pearl. It seemed like pressure into a diamond. I'm gonna be able to put that in my pocket so I can pull it out and look at it. I might get the other two wrong, but I remember what they were. Okay, now I remember it now. The diamond was the most challenging experience that you went through, because I think like a diamond going through pressure. So the thing that was okay, that was really challenging, but I was kind of able to alchemize, work through it, come out the other side of it. And then, okay, maybe I don't remember the ruby. Was it either?
I'm gonna look this up. I literally have my notebook very organized. Okay, so the pearl is the insight, the takeaway, the wisdom that you want to bring back with you. So that under pressure creates the pearl. Yes. Then the ruby is the passion. So it's the red stone. It's that feeling the most alive expression of yourself. And then the diamond is the hardest. And so it's forged from heat and pressure. It's the hardest stone. So what tested you the most? What was the hardest thing that you went through that got you on the other side to be a shimmering and shining diamond? I feel like I need to reintroduce myself to the 3 gems journaling prompt, because it's super powerful. I'm glad I actually found that for us. Yeah,
I love that. I'm glad you had that on hand, because well, I like that it also allows space for the hard, because sometimes we're just we only want to capture this is what was amazing. This is what was amazing. Or, for other people, depending on your like emotional orientation, you also might only struggle with focusing so heavily on this is what was hard, this is what was hard, this is what was hard, without capturing like the Ruby of like, oh, this is what I felt most alive.
Yep. So
So
the
love
pearl,
that.
the passion, and the hardest.
Yeah.
Um, wow, what a cool journaling prompt. I'm definitely gonna start that now that we've talked about it. This
I
is
know,
like for a
same.
reason.
Yeah.
um, the other thing I wanted to double click on because it's feeling really alive for me right now is you mentioned the hawk being like a really spiritual animal for
Mm-hmm.
you. You specifically mentioned a red-tailed hawk, and
Mm-hmm.
I just moved into a new house about 2 months ago, and there is a red-tailed hawk nest like right up in a super tall pine tree overlooking this cranberry bog
Mm-hmm.
that's like basically my backyard. And there's two hawks that live there, and they like swoop around the house all day, and then they go and hunt in the cranberry bog, and they come back. And whenever I walk outside, I hear them. They like
Mm-hmm.
screech to me and like speak to me. And myself and my husband have both had these like really, really intense experiences with these hawks that like are now they're like, no, welcome to our house. And we're like, okay, yeah, like are we cool, like do you guys like
Yeah.
us? And so we both had these really, really kind of cool experiences with these hawks over the past 2 months that we've lived here, and they've like really welcomed us onto this land. And like it's just been such a really cool experience to communicate with them in a way that's just like, okay, yeah, I see you, you see me,
Mm-hmm.
I understand that you're here. And they kind of send like mini messages to us all the time. And so I wanted to talk about your experience with this woman drawing wings, and then you
Mm-hmm.
realizing that you had this really deep connection as somebody that can see deeply, or a seer, um, and how that relates to the connection that you have with hawks, or with like any I don't know if there's other winged creatures that you have
Mm-hmm.
connections with, but I wanted to kind of click on that for a moment because it's something that is just like really resonant in my life right now because the hawks are living right outside my house.
Yeah. Well, first, I love that that's so fun that you get to have that relationship with the hawks as well. Like, right. And get to have like all these different interactions with them, especially their nest, and you get to watch their regular habitat. There's so much for us to learn from the animals around us when we slow down and look and listen.
Yeah, their nest is like, it's literally like probably 15 feet from our house. And
Mm.
so, I mean, anytime we walk out the door, they go nuts because we're so close to like their home. but
Yeah.
but yeah, it's been really kind of cool to have these experiences with them, especially when they like circle over the house, and like
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, keep going and spiral
Mm-hmm.
around me. So it's been really cool. But yeah, what is your experience with kind of just that deeper knowing, especially when that woman drew those wings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was that the first time that you knew you had that connection, or
Mm-hmm.
did you always feel like you had a deep connection?
So the energy of it, like the seeing aspect, have known that, and if because I've felt that when I can, like, even in leadership and leading sales teams, like having a one-on-one with someone and just dropping into a presence where you can see into the other, that's been with me, but the animal part of it had not. And so, yeah, what happened after that experience, I then left her house, and because like her and her husband and I were sat in a ceremony together, and I leave her house, and immediately on the driveway, like across the street, there's these two like eagles on like posted on either side of the driveway. And it's kind of, so I just start, all of a sudden I just start seeing everywhere. And I'm driving back up. At the time we lived like north of San Luis Obispo. So I'm driving back up through Santa Barbara. My wife and I got engaged on the top of the San Ynez Mountains above Montecito in Santa Barbara. And I felt this pull that said, go back up there. So there's a huge road called Gibraltar. It's like 10-mile climb. Went up to the top, and on my way up there, and I see these people about to hang glide. And I was like, whoa, I've never seen this before. And I was like, can I watch you all? And I'm like, sure. So I'm just sitting here on like the hood of my car watching these people just run off the mountain with a, hang gliding. And I was like, that was wild. Right after they leave, these two hawks circle above me, screeching. And I felt this, I'm so strong. You're here to communicate something to me. And then I go back up to the spot where my wife and I got engaged, kind of did a meditation, prayer, my own little solo, like kind of ceremony there, just to sit in that place as I had just gone through a transformational experience, going back to a space where I had a transformational experience. Went down the mountain, got back where we were living at the time was this retreat center. We lived in a tiny house we had built. And I pull around to where the tiny house is, and there's this big tree where you go around to where the house is. And I saw this huge hawk fly into the tree, and I felt something in me, not like an audible voice, but go to the tree. Okay, so I go to the tree, and I felt something say, "Climb up in the tree." I was like, okay. So I empty all my pockets, and I start climbing in this tree. And I'm probably 15, 20, like I'm high in this tree. I'm not high. I'm high up spatially. Um, and like 20 feet in this tree. And I just was like, what are you doing, Sam? Like, this is ridiculous. You think you're being like guided to be, I'm like, I started having those doubts in my head, like, this is nuts. And in that moment, I look up and she's right there, like 3-4 feet from my head, talons, beak, like a gaze that is deeper and more piercing than I've ever experienced in my life. And I'm balancing on a branch like this big round way up in this tree and just like, whoa. And similar to what you said, I was like, am I okay to be here? And this is all nonverbal. Am I allowed to be here? And I felt like a very clear yes. Okay. And this hawk and I, for about 15 to 20 minutes, didn't break eye contact. Like 20 minutes, 20 feet up in this tree, just locked eye to eye. And what I felt from her, I say her, it felt like a she energetically. When we talk about shame and we talk about being that message, I got to be a seer, you have to be willing to be seen. It was the most exposing witnessing I'd ever experienced in my life, which I felt being that piercing gaze. That it was, think of it like a positive version of like the eye in Lord of the Rings, but like it pierces and sees all and loves all. It was like, I can see everything about who you are, everything you've done, everything you've left undone, every choice you regret, every choice you love. I mean, all of it. And I'm still sitting here and holding you in a presence of love. I mean, we didn't break eye contact for, it was about 20 minutes. And I'm just sitting there, just even as it's happening, I was like, wait, this is happening. I didn't have framework to understand a human animal, wild animal interaction like that. And eventually felt time to get down from the tree. So I climbed down. And then I remember asking again, non-verbally, I want to see you fly. And she took 2 hops and flew and then circled over our house screeching. And in that moment, what I felt was being communicated to me was this her being like, I've always been watching over you. I've been the one holding this energetic space. Because when we lived in that space, first time I ever did any sort of medicine, changed my life, conceived our first kid. It was just like a super transformational space for my wife and I. And so I got to see the 2 aspects of the hawk as the seer and then as the sentinel who stands and holds guard and holds the container and holds the safety. And that's the aspect of my grounded masculine that over the last 8 years, whatever, since that experience, I've really, especially this year in Fit for Service, more deeply than any other season of my life, I've like leaned into that sentinel aspect of the hawk, not just the seer that flies around, but I can sit and I can hold, I because of the vision, I'm focused on creating safety and holding that container. So that was my first, that was like the initiatory experience I had with that animal. And then it's been, as I mentioned, like a staple that shows up in my life when I step out to be seen in true vulnerability. The hawk will fly through to the point where I have it tattooed across my ribs of a red-tailed hawk.
I'm so glad I asked.
Yeah. I've never shared that story publicly, which is fun.
Wow. Well, I think it's so it's so interesting that you got this like inner knowing, like, okay, go to the tree, climb the tree. Like, I think like in our own way, we've all had these like little like signals, like to go do something that it's a nonverbal signal from nature to go to something. And then like cut to that like doubt that like crept in, because also we're human. And so we get these like moments where we just completely fucking doubt ourselves, doubt our power, doubt that we are like, because there's the moment of like individualization where it's like, oh, you think you're special, you're not special, right? When in fact we're all special, we're all the equal, like we all get to have these like beautiful experiences when we start to notice them. And so you chose to kind of look at that and say, okay, there's the doubt creeping in, but I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to keep going. And like, yes, I need to be in this tree right now. And I think you got the gift from not following that thread to say like, oh, you know what? You're right. Let's climb back down. This is stupid. Like, why'd I even come up here? you know? But you actually sat in that moment and had that really, really beautiful gift of having this experience with such a wild creature. I mean, for that hawk to be like staring in your eyes for so long, I mean, wow, that's really amazing. So, yeah, I'm glad I asked, but also now you get the gift of that experience being a synchronicity that then gets to weave into your life, that now whenever you see a hawk, you're like, oh yeah, I'm being guarded. I'm being completely held and completely seen in a way that with non-judgment, in a way of like, I see you and I love you. So thank you for sharing that story. That's really, really beautiful. And I've had my own experience with like winged creatures. And I actually am not wearing my bracelet today, but normally I'm wearing my like hawk-ish bracelet.
Cool. That's beautiful.
Thank you. And it's called the Winged Ones. And it's like just my token of my version of the tattoo so that it can be with me all the time to say like, oh, okay, you're truly like connected to this creature. And whenever I wear my bird bracelet, like I always have experiences with like winged creatures in some way, shape, or form where I'm like, okay, yep, nod from the universe. So it's more about the paying attention to when nature has these little gifts for us that we just get to experience. But if we live life too fast and we don't like just stop and enjoy those little mundane moments, we might miss the gift in that. And so I'm so glad you climbed that tree.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that reflection too, because I don't know if I've really sat with that aspect of that story of the listening and responding, and then the doubt coming in, but sticking with it, anyway. And so that was actually a helpful reflection for me of where in my life am I getting that same inner nudge again, but I'm letting the doubt squash it. And I've sensed, maybe, closed off a potential branching of a different path that could have opened up. So that's something for me that's coming up even just in this conversation that I'm reflecting on, of like, ooh, I'm going to sit with that.
I feel like I do that to myself all the time. I'm like, yeah, you did, and then it's like doubt. Yeah. So yeah, that's like a constant ceremony for me. It's just like to continue not having doubt for myself that, to be seen, to share more. Yeah. I mean, speaking of being a seer, it's all about really sharing all of the things, all the pearls, all the rubies, all the diamonds, and sharing all of the things that really kind of cohesively kind of bring it back around to the light and the shadow. Because you can share all the light, but if you don't also share the shadow, there's no juxtaposition there. So I appreciate the sharing that you've had in not only these beautiful experiences with the hawk, but also some of the working through your deepest moments of shame, and how you integrate ceremony into your everyday life. Where if people want to continue to follow your chronicling of your spiritual journey, where can they find you? Where are you most active? And is there any like social media you could share with the world, or anywhere that people can just get to know a little bit more about who is Sam?
Yeah. So my Instagram, I started this year putting just, as you mentioned, that chronicling, like much more just short little clips of here's what I'm learning, here's what's coming up in my process of my day-to-day spiritual journey. And it's just my name and my middle initial. So Sam D Best, middle name Davidson. So Sam D Best on Instagram. And
Sam the best.
Sam the best. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. No,
I didn't even notice that before,
comical.
but now it would never leave my brain now.
It's yeah. I mean, there's a whole nother thread we go down. Like the amount of times we have a last name like Best, like it's always acknowledged or mentioned in some way. And I had a quip I would always say. I was like, yeah, it's a lot to live up to, and I would do it like just, and then eventually I was like, oh, fuck, that is like my thing of like setting completely unrealistic expectations for myself to try to meet them, like to live up to my name. And so that's been like a whole ceremony in of itself to learn to be more gracious with myself and what does best look like. Yeah, I think of Shakespeare wasn't a name. I'm also on LinkedIn because I do play in the corporate space, and what I share on Instagram and LinkedIn is a bit different, but because I think there's, it goes back to what we shared there in the beginning of being conscious of the audience you're sharing to, and not in a way to hide or not to be truthful, but in a way to, what are the edges? How I think about it is like, what are the edges of digestibility? I think there's certain spaces, like if I'm at Fit for Service, there's certain things I don't have to explain or maybe articulate in a particular way, because I was like, I know what you're talking about. But then if I'm, in the conference room, and there might be, because I want to be intentional about language and helping something be approachable, I might use a little bit different language. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. I do write there quite a bit as well. For a very different audience, but yeah,
I will connect with you on LinkedIn. We're not connected on LinkedIn, so
let's make it happen.
Come on, let's go immediately. Yeah, and I think the digestibility is a huge thing, but also like what will resonate with that audience the most, so that they can take the most away from it. And so when you talk about like what can they digest, like what can they digest, but also what can they like assimilate into their lives too. So what would be the deeper resonance? And so the messaging is different from a corporate perspective. So I appreciate that you have the ability to weave in and out of different groups and containers and be able to really communicate in a way that is digestible to multiple different frames of reference, because we talked about like being the chameleon who can weave in and out, not in a negative way, but in a way that is really helpful. So I appreciate that. So Sam D Best on Instagram, and then Sam Best on LinkedIn. I will link all of that in the show notes. But before we jump off here, is there anything else you wanted to share that we didn't get to really dive into, because we went like complete free form, like really no prep at all. Which I love, because we ended up going down some really cool, just like, I'll call them branches, since we're on that analogy, and we got to experience some things that I didn't even know we were going to talk about. So that's for me is the most fun. But is there anything that is really live for you right now that we didn't get a chance to chat about?
Yeah, the one thing I'll end on is I'm going to share this from my experience, and with an assumption that it's more general, is that I've spent, ever since I had that death of my identity and vision leaving the Congo, I've spent the last decade really struggling with questions around meaning and purpose. Like, what am I supposed to do with my life? As if there is one calling, and if I don't find it, I've missed it. And I'm going to sit on my deathbed. I'm going to meet God and be told how I missed the purpose of my life. And that has been such a massive existential fear for me. And I'm imagining, especially after the pandemic, things were shook up, that there might be a number of people feeling that, like, what am I doing with my life? What am I supposed to be doing with my life? And the one thing I'd want to share, because mainly I want to share this for myself to continue to hear, is that you can't miss it. Like, it will find you. The life you are weaving together through when it makes sense and doesn't make sense, it'll, like, it's going to be perfect. And I think of, in the song Truckin' by the Grateful Dead, bit of a deadhead, they said, there's a line that says, sometimes the light's all shining on me. Other times I can barely see. Lately it occurs to me what a long, strange trip it's been. And that's the thing I want to share. There's going to be times it feels really clear. There's going to be times it feels completely murky and you don't know where the next step is. And it's all for your good. It's all to teach you exactly what you need. And you'll be able to look back and see how perfect all of it was, even the shittiest parts. So that's the one thing I'll end on.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And it's another synchronicity, because I've been going through this like massive questioning of like, there's two choices. Am I making the right choice? And I always end on, well, of course I'm making the right choice, because all the choices are going to lead to the same end game. And so it doesn't matter which choice. And so even though I struggle with like, okay, there's two paths, which one do you go down? Like, which road do you take? It doesn't really matter, because in the end, you're going to connect to that deeper purpose, and everything is going to happen in exactly the right order that it needs to happen in. And you kind of only can see that in retrospect a little bit. So as you get older, which you and I aren't even really that old, but as you get older, you start to reflect and see more and more and more. But even kind of now, as I look back, and as you mentioned, looking back like 10 years ago, this happened when you left the Congo. It's like, then you start to see all the tracks. Then you start to see like, oh, these choices were made for a specific reason. And so we don't necessarily need to know exactly what choice to make, because it will all end up exactly where it's supposed to be. So thank you for sharing that. This has been a really fun conversation. Super excited that you said yes to coming on the show. I'm really pumped for this to air. So thank you so much for jumping on. And I know our paths are going to cross again. So hope to see you soon. And just enjoy the rest of your week. We didn't even get into the ancestral hunting school, but another time we'll chat about that offline. But thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate everything that you've brought to us, and thank you for your wisdom.
Thank you so much. It was so fun to be on here, and I really appreciate that you giving a platform to our stories and giving a platform to the things that we're learning, so that we can share and learn from as many people as we can.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. Please forgive me.